Last warning, I'm Force Recon trained. She said it once, level, not loud. She said it to the nearest instructor, not to the room, not to the group, not to Hollister standing 20 feet back with his arms crossed and his weight on his heels, just to the man close enough that she could feel the warmth off his forearm. The combative's yard had gone quiet, the way yards go quiet, when something does not fit, when the expected response fails to arrive, and every waiting person recalibrates. 6 bodies had closed the distance over the matted pit. 6 bodies had stopped at 3 feet. One of them had leaned in. Not contact. Never contact. Not yet. Practicing the intimidation that had worked 100 times before. And the word had gone out into the quiet and come back wrong. She did not step back. 6 hours. That was how long she had been on the installation. Gunnery Sergeant Dale Hollister had her file by 0800 hours. Contractor credential. Civilian pipeline attachment. Force Recon assessment background. Washout note on page 3. Medical withdrawal at the 6-week mark of the basic reconnaissance course. The kind of paper trail that arrived pre-digested and thin. The kind that told you exactly what you needed to know about someone who had almost made it and settled for the next best thing. He had called the cadre together before the midday session without making it a formal thing. Just a nod, lazy and deliberate. And the 6 of them had started walking toward the woman with the clipboard at the far edge of the mat. Shoulder to shoulder. Standard pressure formation. The nearest man leaned in. He had done this 80 times across 4 years on this yard. It always produced the half-step retreat, the weight shift, the moment when someone who did not belong acknowledged that they did not belong. He waited for it. Her feet were exactly where they had been for the past 2 minutes, hands loose at her sides, clipboard hanging from 2 fingers, not gripped, not pressed to her chest, not used as a barrier between her body and theirs. Breathing through her nose, paced and even, the breathing of someone who was not allocating oxygen to managing fear because there was no fear to manage. She looked at the nearest instructor and said it once, specific and unhurried, for him and not for the performance. Last warning. I'm Force Recon trained. Then she looked past him directly to Hollister. The yard held the silence for 3 full seconds. Hollister broke it with a short, contemptuous laugh, the laugh of a man who owned every silence on this installation and demonstrated that ownership by ending it on his schedule. He waved his cadre back toward the pit with one hand and turned as he walked, saying something low and deliberate, and the chorus of laughter that followed was the sound of a social structure reaffirming itself around a joke at someone else's expense. He raised his voice. Look at that. She's writing us up. Better watch yourself, boys. We've got a hall monitor. She was already writing. The pen had been moving before the laughter finished. She had logged 3 scoring irregularities before the confrontation, and she logged a 4th in the 90 seconds after. She did not look up at Hollister or his cadre or the resumed session with anything more than the peripheral awareness of an assessor doing the job she had been credentialed to do. The pen kept moving. At the weight rack line along the perimeter fence, Sergeant Major Reginald Okafor had stopped walking. He was not part of this session. He was passing on his way to the battalion training annex, 2nd Circuit of the installation grounds that morning. The slow, methodical kind that a 30-year Marine makes, not because anything is obviously wrong, but because 30 years teaches you that wrong shows up quietly before it shows up loudly. He had watched the approach. 6 bodies, shoulder to shoulder, closing on the civilian assessor at the mat's edge, had watched her stand still when they stopped, had watched every movement that followed, or rather, had watched the absence of movement, which was the specific thing that stayed with him as he resumed walking and reached the far gate. He looked back once. She was still writing. He had spent 6 years embedded with a Marine Special Operations Battalion. He had watched MARSOC operators work. He knew what discipline under pressure looked like from the outside, knew the specific weight distribution, the specific regulation of breath, the stillness of someone trained to hold ground as though retreating had simply never been made available to their nervous system. It was not the stillness of nerve or of performance. It was the stillness of training that had become physical reflex, built over years in environments where losing it cost something real. It didn't fit the file. The file said, medical withdrawal at 6 weeks, civilian contractor, pipeline assessor clinging to an installation that would not have her as anything more than an evaluator. The way she had stood said something else entirely, and Sergeant Major Reginald Okafor, who had filed away useful intelligence for 3 decades without always knowing immediately why it was useful, filed this away and kept walking, because that was what 30 years had also taught him. You file it, you keep moving, and you wait. She was still writing when he turned the corner. 3 days later, 0630. The yard belonged entirely to Hollister's cadre. He placed her in a folding chair at the far corner of the mat, the corner behind the equipment shed wall, the sightline obstruction corner, the place where assessors went when the cadre wanted an assessor to exist on paper without existing in the room. As Decker walked past with the equipment box on his shoulder, Hollister tipped his head toward the folding chair without breaking stride. Civilians got the corner today. She wants to observe. She can observe from there. He said it loud enough that the chair heard it too. He ran the 0630 session with his back to her position from the moment the session began. No instructor was directed toward her. No candidate was walked past her corner. The pretense was not subtle. It was the institutional version of the children's table, deliberate and unmistakable and invisible in every sense that would survive a formal complaint. It was a significant mistake. She had a legal pad and the undivided attention that comes from having nothing to do except observe without the distraction of being engaged. She logged weight disparities in the grappling pairings. 11 of 14 pairings in the first 40 minutes placed smaller candidates against partners with a 30-pound advantage or greater, and the pattern was not random. She logged time windows between circuit rotations, which deviated from the standardized assessment protocol she had memorized before insertion at a rate of 11 discrepancies in the first 40 minutes. The junior instructor on the scoring detail filled out the session log at a table 20 feet from her position without offering her a copy, which was a deviation, and she read his entries from the angle of his pen and the cadence of his wrist movement, which was a skill she had learned in a surveillance course that did not appear anywhere on her contractor credential. She logged those as well. Lance Corporal Priya Santosh, 21 years old. Pre-selection cycle, female candidate. Creek had Santosh's file before insertion, the real one and the filed one, side by side. 11 discrepancies she had flagged and memorized before day 1. She knew what Santosh's actual test results looked like, and she knew what the pipeline file said they looked like, and those were not the same document. Hollister put Santosh and 3 other female candidates through a grappling circuit paired against male training partners who outweighed them by 30-plus pounds. The circuit design was not ambiguous. It was engineered to produce failure within the scoring parameters, specific combinations of pairing disparity, timing, and assessment category that allowed a failing mark to appear technically legitimate on a form that no one above the cadre level was currently reviewing. Creek noted the margin, noted the pairing rationale she had reconstructed from the session structure, noted the exact scoring differential that would remove Santosh from the pre-selection roster with paperwork that looked clean. The male candidate went down at 0712, ankle roll 40 feet away, sudden and hard. The assigned instructor was across the pit running the secondary circuit. Creek was closest. She made the decision in the time it took to stand, and moved without announcing it, crossed the distance, dropped to one knee, and ran a 12-second tactile assessment. Proximal phalange, anterior talofibular. The sequence went through her hands the way sequences go when they have been run 10,000 times in a combative's pit. Hip-driven, economical, completely fluid. The motion of someone whose hands had been trained to do this until it required nothing from the conscious mind. She called the result without looking up from the candidate's ankle. Grade 2. Not structural. He can walk it off if you want to continue the rotation, or I can flag him out. Your call, Gunny. Hollister did not look at her. He looked past her at the candidate. Torres. Walk it off. He turned back to the primary circuit. Corporal Vance, Hollister's runner, 22 years old, who had developed the particular sideways peripheral attention of a young NCO, learning to notice things before he understood them, tilted his head a fraction of a degree, and watched her return to the folding chair. She was already on the legal pad before she sat down. The pen was moving. Vance leaned toward the junior instructor next to him at the scoring table. Low, the way you say something you don't quite want to commit to. You see her hands? The junior looked at him, didn't follow. Vance shook his head once. Nothing. That evening she added 2 entries to the mission log. Santosh's name, the deviation metrics, the pairing formula she had now reconstructed across 4 observed sessions. And Hollister's session timing pattern, the structure of exclusion, was coordinated across multiple sessions at consistent intervals. Someone had designed the calendar. It was not improvised, which meant it was organized, which meant the paper trail for it existed somewhere in the administrative chain. Sergeant Major Okafor, who had made his second fence line pass at 0700 that morning, had seen her move from 40 feet away. He kept walking. But at the edge of the instructor shed, after the session cleared and the cadre moved to the morning debrief, he stopped. He stood at the shed wall and said one word quietly to nobody. Rotation. He turned it over. Civilian contractors from the assessment pipeline said, drill. Sometimes exercise, sometimes session. No one who washed out at the 6-week mark of the Force Recon pipeline used rotation, not the way she had used it. Automatic and flat. The only word available because it was the only word the pipeline taught you. He stood there and did not write the word down because he did not need to. He went still in the way he had learned to go still when something inside a situation shifted and the shape of the situation changed. Then he kept moving. File it. Wait. 7 days on, 11:45 hours. Day 10. The locker area adjacent to the training facility. Hollister was not on the yard. That was the new variable. Every previous escalation had placed him somewhere visible, present, performing, reading the room with the specific attention of a man who wanted credit for his own operations. Now he was the architect, and the instrument was Staff Sergeant Kwame Decker, 31, Hollister's primary enforcement NCO, who moved through institutional spaces the way that pressure moves through pipe, contained, directional, arriving exactly where the system sent him. Creek was logging notes from the morning session, alone. Transition window between sessions, no officer present. The social temperature permissive in the specific way it gets permissive, when institutional oversight has rotated elsewhere and everyone remaining understands it. Decker came through the main entrance with 2 NCOs flanking him. They positioned themselves between Creek and the only exit. Casual, crowded. The geometry of implied obstruction that stopped just short of anything documentable from the outside. Decker addressed her with elaborate false courtesy. He was checking in, he said, seeing how the assessment was progressing, making sure she had everything she needed from the cadre. He wanted her to know the training element was 100% behind the civilian assessment mission, valued it enormously, saw their role as supporting hers. He said it with the careful warmth of a man performing support for an audience of 2 flankers who were there to confirm he had said nothing objectionable. Then he unfolded a printed sheet and began reading from her contractor intake file. The washed-out pipeline history, the 6-week notation, the medical withdrawal record, a prior performance comment from an assessment supervisor that was accurate in every specific detail and weaponized in its framing. He read it in the tone of a man sharing relevant context with someone who deserved to have it. Says here, your Recon pipeline run ended at the 6-week mark. Medical withdrawal. We see a lot of those. A measured pause. Civilian assessors are a valuable asset to the Marine Corps, ma'am. We want you to know you're welcome here. Creek kept writing. Her pen had not stopped moving since the moment Decker walked through the door. Lance Corporal Santosh came through the side door. Wrong place. Wrong moment. She stopped inside the threshold, reading the room, and Decker pivoted with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done this before, pivoted and began reciting Santosh's pre-selection performance metrics from the file. The filed file, the falsified one that showed failing marks on circuits Santosh had completed correctly and been scored wrong. He listed them aloud and systematically. Santosh went rigid in the way 21-year-olds go rigid when a senior NCO reads their failures aloud in a room with witnesses assembled to confirm them. Creek took one step, unhurried, no announcement. She placed herself between Decker and the Lance Corporal, back to the junior, face forward. One deliberate repositioning that removed Santosh from Decker's direct line and recentered his attention on the original target. No words, just the understanding, built from experience in rooms like this one, that Decker could only sustain pressure on one focal point at a time. He refocused on Creek. Santosh was forgotten. Both outcomes were exactly what Creek had intended. The 3 NCOs closed in around her corner, not touching, not technically threatening in any sense that would survive a formal complaint, just present and close. The crowded geometry of a space manufactured for one purpose. She sat at the same angle she had been sitting, did not press back against the locker behind her to manufacture distance, did not adjust her shoulders or her weight, occupied the exact space she had been occupying, completely still, while Decker talked, and the NCO to her immediate left stood close enough that she could have registered his presence without looking. She was paying attention to Decker's word choice. They left. Santosh was still in the corner near the side door. Creek looked at her. Brief. Neutral, neither performing alarm nor performing reassurance, because both would have been wrong, and Santosh needed neither. Santosh got out, "Ma'am, and didn't finish. The sentence stopped against something she couldn't get around. Creek waited one beat. Then, "You didn't say anything wrong. Write down what you remember when you get to your bunk tonight, just for yourself." Santosh nodded. Once. Small. Then Creek put the pen to the page. 45 seconds. Time stamped. Location. Witness count. Every word Decker had said, in the sequence he had said it, with the pauses noted. She capped the pen, closed the notebook. The cover was visible for one moment before she tucked it under her arm. Standard contractor binder on the outside. Inside, tabbed, numbered, indexed. The architecture of documentation built to survive formal review. Not something a civilian assessor constructs. Something an operator builds when the evidence package has to be unimpeachable. The cadre just ran a coordinated intimidation operation against a federal assessor and a female pipeline candidate, in a locker room, with no officers present, in front of no one they thought mattered. Did they pick the wrong target? Keep watching. Decker thought he had run a clean operation. Technically, he had. No direct threat. Nothing that produced a bruise or a written order. Nothing that would survive challenge as harassment in a formal venue. He had used the institution against her. Her own file, her own history. The paperwork she could not dispute because it was accurate. He had brought 2 witnesses to confirm that the interaction was collegial. He had done it in a transition window when no officer was present, and the social pressure of rank flowed entirely in one direction. What he had not done was run it in front of someone who was not who the file said she was. 8 days later, 0900 hours, day 18. Hollister was not present. He did not need to be. A formal contractor misconduct report had arrived in the training operations chain overnight. Unauthorized documentation, interference with training cadre operations, 2 specific incidents cited with date stamps and language drawn from the cadre's own session notes. The charges were procedurally thin. The paperwork was completely real. The escort access review it triggered was mandatory. If the report stood uncontested for 72 hours, Creek would lose yard access. And if she lost yard access, she could not document what was being done to the pipeline, which was the entire point of the operation. On paper, her position was deteriorating in exactly the way a civilian contractor's position deteriorates when an institutional machine decides she is a problem. Captain Dana Mercer, 29, USMC, Installation Training Operations Officer, Hollister's administrative superior, the officer who had been processing his paperwork without reading it closely enough, sat across the desk from Creek at 0900 and informed her of the report. She read the charges aloud. She was visibly uncomfortable. She had processed enough of Hollister's paperwork to know what thin looked like, and this was thin, but she had no authority to decline processing it, and she was not the kind of officer who would have tried. I want to be straight with you. This report came from the cadre level. I have to process it. That means your escort access is under review. You've got 72 hours to file a counterstatement through the contractor liaison office. Creek took the report. Read it fully, Mercer noticed. She read fast, systematically, line by line, the way someone reads who is scanning for specific content and knows precisely what they are looking for. She set it down. She asked one question. Is the original assessment mandate document still on file with your training operations chain, or has it been rerouted? Mercer paused. A mandate document was not civilian pipeline language. The term was MARSOC internal operational terminology for the sanctioning brief that authorized an operative's access and established the investigative parameters for the mission. No Force Recon pipeline contractor used it. Mercer did not catch the terminology. She was already reaching for her files to check the chain and answer the procedural question. But she would remember, later, that Creek had asked it, and that Creek had not appeared frightened by the misconduct report. She had appeared, Mercer would later tell investigators, slightly preoccupied with something other than her own situation. Creek returned to her quarters, opened the mission log, encrypted, maintained separately from the contractor notebook, a different layer of the operation entirely. Added one entry noting the misconduct report and its timestamp. Photographed the report with her personal device, compressed the file, transmitted it through a secure channel she had not used since the first day of insertion, addressed to no one on the installation. 11 minutes later, the response arrived. 2 words. Understood. Proceed. The counterstatement form sat on her field desk. 72 hours on the clock. She had not touched it. She was working methodically through a cross-reference of the candidate files that had been altered, building the secondary corroboration she still needed on the 2 incomplete entries in her documentation package. The counterstatement would resolve itself through a channel Hollister did not know existed and could not access. She worked until 0130 hours. Then she slept. Hollister passed her on the yard that evening, the first time he had looked directly at her since day 3. He said nothing. He looked satisfied in the specific way people look satisfied when they believe a problem is resolving on its own. Creek did not look at him. She was already past this move, past the whole sequence of it, working several positions ahead of the one Hollister was still playing. The misconduct report was Hollister's cleanest play. It used the institution against itself. If her access was revoked, she couldn't document what he was doing to the pipeline. No confrontation, no witnesses, no yard. Just paperwork moving through a channel that would process it automatically if no counterstatement arrived in time. It was the kind of trap that ended civilian careers without leaving fingerprints, and it had ended them before. What Hollister did not know was that the counterstatement was not the only play available to her, and that she had already made hers. Mercer, for her part, did not know what to make of the conversation. She had expected a civilian contractor facing the loss of yard access to arrive with either defensive agitation or defeated compliance, the two registers she had seen from contractors in trouble. Creek had arrived with neither. She had asked a procedural question, read the report like a lawyer reading a contract, and left the office with the report under her arm and an expression that suggested she had already moved past the problem the report represented to whatever problem came after it. Mercer sat in her office for a long time after the door closed, reviewing what had just happened, and arrived at no useful conclusion. Day 25, 1800 hours. The credential dossier was open on Okafor's desk. He had been running it every third day since the observation that could not quite be named had settled permanently in the back of his operational awareness. The basic reconnaissance course reference checked out. The pipeline history checked out. The washout. The medical withdrawal. The timeline. The civilian contractor designation. The assessment firm. The installation attachment order. Cross-referenced. Consistent. Clean. Everything checked out. He sat back. That was the problem, not the content, the texture of the file itself. Real personnel files had friction, a date transposition, a form filed in the wrong sequence, a supervisor's comment that didn't quite track with the official timeline by 2 days. Files about real people accumulated small inconsistencies, the way real people accumulated small scars, not dramatic, just present. The evidence of actual experience moving through bureaucratic systems that were never quite designed for it. This file had none of that. It was smooth in a way that required either extraordinary administrative discipline or deliberate construction, and he had seen both in 30 years, and he knew which one was rarer. He called Master Sergeant Delinda Rowe at 1830. Former embed colleague, 8 years. One deployment cycle he did not discuss in official channels. She picked up on the second ring, and he spoke quietly with the door to his office closed. "I'm not asking you to pull a file. I'm asking you to tell me if the number I'm about to read you appears anywhere it shouldn't. Yes or no." He read the contractor credential number. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would check and call him back. That afternoon, under the pretext of a counterstatement timeline meeting he had requested, Okafor walked a slow circuit of the conference room while Creek sat at the table. Standard probe, movement behind a subject, circling, reading baseline behavior under mild ambient threat. A nervous subject cannot fully suppress torso rotation when something passes behind them. Anxiety migrates to the shoulders first, then the upper spine follows the impulse to track. A trained person can prevent themselves from turning their head. No one can entirely train themselves out of the torso's impulse to follow a threat at their back. Creek's eyes tracked him with precision. Her head rotated. Her torso did not move at all. Body fixed, weight centered, completely still. Only her eyes moving, tracking his circuit with the calibration of something trained rather than reactive. He made a second slow circuit. Same result. The conversation stayed bureaucratic. Counterstatement procedure, timeline, options available to her. She answered in short, flat sentences. She was giving him nothing. He had already gotten what he came for. Rowe called back at 2100 hours. Creek's credential number ran clean in the contractor system. Confirmed. A beat of silence. Then Rose's voice shifted into a register Okafor recognized, the register of someone who has looked through a door they did not expect to open and is choosing their next words with care. Sergeant Major. A pause that had weight in it. Don't touch this one. Just don't touch it. She hung up. Creek, that same evening, found that 2 more names had been removed from the corrected pipeline queue through an administrative update, bearing no author notation. Santosh's name was among them, her jaw set, one contraction of muscle, brief and controlled. She made a phone call. 11 seconds, 1 sentence. She hung up and wrote a new entry. The pen moved fast and stopped clean. Okafor set the credential dossier face down on his desk, opened a different drawer, his personal notebook, worn and unofficial, not part of any administrative system because it was never intended to be. He wrote 1 line, capped the pen, closed the cover. He sat for a moment without moving. He was no longer treating this like a contractor situation. Sergeant Major Okafor had pulled her credential number and been told, by someone who had access to administrative records he could not access himself, to stop looking. He was a 30-year Marine with 6 years embedded in MARSOC-adjacent operations. He knew what compartmented looked like from the outside. The next time he looked at that contractor on the yard, he would not be looking at a contractor. Comment below. What do you think he writes in that notebook? He sat with the closed notebook for a long time in the quiet of the office. Outside, the installation was running its evening routine, the sounds of a training post cycling down, vehicles on the access road, the distant close of a heavy door somewhere in the battalion area. He had made contact with someone who had access to records he could not reach and asked a question she had answered by refusing to answer it. In 30 years of Marine service that had included 6 years adjacent to MARSOC operations, he had encountered that specific kind of non-answer 3 times. All 3 times, the person being protected by the non-answer had turned out to be operating in a compartmented environment that he did not have authorization to see. Day 32. 22:30 hours. The installation was quiet at that hour, in the specific way military installations go quiet, between their intervals of activity. Not peaceful, just paused, the machinery resting before the next interval of grinding. She sat at the field desk with the laptop open and the mission log complete for the day. No operational task requiring the next hour. She did not fill it with anything else. She ran the arithmetic the way a critical skills officer runs arithmetic, flat, forward-looking, without sentimentality in the calculation. 32 days, 11 falsified files confirmed, each cross-referenced with precision against the original test data she had brought into insertion. 3 cadre NCOs identified on Hollister's direct enforcement chain, with documentation supporting each link. The mandate window closed at 45 days. If Colonel Webb did not move before that threshold, the evidence package aged out of the operational window, and the pipeline stayed contaminated. 13 days. She closed the laptop. The memory came in the way it always came now. Not as a wave, not as dramatic intrusion, just present. The way a scar is present when the temperature drops below a certain point. Simply there. A position overrun at 0200 hours in 2024. A compromised exfil route. The 11 seconds of map reading in the dark that produced the only option remaining. 4 people in the element. 2 possible routes. One exposed 120 meters of open ground to a compromised position. She had taken the longer route, added 4 minutes to the exfil, and 4 of them had reached the second vehicle. Corporal Fitch had not. She had been 28 years old. She had made the call with 4 voices on the radio and a map she had memorized 3 days before deployment, and she had made the right call. This she understood. In the way you understand things that do not comfort you, knowing it was right did not change the fact of it. The Silver Star was classified. She had never mentioned it to anyone on this installation, and she would not. She opened the secure channel. drafted the operational update. Her natural register came out automatically, unpressured. The Marsoc lexicon that had become her native language since the designation was conferred in 2025, and the training was complete. Surveillance package. Mandate window at 13 days. Documentation threshold met on 9 of 11 files, with 2 pending secondary corroboration. She used the language without suppressing it because there was no one here to suppress it for. No one watching. This was who she was now. Unobserved. The contractor persona was a surface she wore. This was underneath it. She closed the update, opened the secondary folder, flagged before insertion, not opened since day 1. A contact report, partially redacted, with a name at the bottom, a theater designation, and a date stamp that ended in a number she could not read through the redaction. She had first seen the name on a targeting deck in 2024, standing in a blown position in the dark, with one Marine already gone, and the exfil route compromised, and the element moving. She had pulled the deck to cross-reference a contact in the secondary zone, and seen the name for the first time. She had flagged it. The operation had ended before she could reach it. Marsoc had picked up the thread in 2025. The thread ran forward into the present and showed no sign of terminating. She looked at the page for a long moment. Still there, she thought. Active and unresolved. She set the folder aside. The page remained on the desk. The name, Yusuf Mehdi. The theater designation beside it, Western Sahel. She had looked at it twice tonight. She did not look a third time. The part of her that was still the 28-year-old who had carried an element out of the Western Sahel on a decision made in 11 seconds had never fully quieted. It was not loud. It did not announce itself, did not color everything she looked at, did not need to be managed. It was simply present. The weight of Fitch's name in the back of every operation she planned. The specific care with which she memorized the 3 closest exits in every unfamiliar space. The reason she did not leave the cover photograph folded shut, because she had learned something about herself in 2024. That she was the kind of person who could carry the weight of a decision made correctly and still understand that correctly was not the same as without cost. That distinction, she had found, made her better at the job, not easier. Better. Day 40. 1640 hours. The afternoon session running. Hollister arrived heated. Something above him had moved against his interest that morning. The mandate document had resurfaced in Mercer's administrative chain without explanation, which meant the 72-hour access review had quietly closed, which meant the misconduct report had produced nothing, which meant 40 days of running every institutional play available to him had produced nothing that stuck, and she was still at the assessment table with the legal pad and the pen moving day after day, and he was done waiting for the situation to resolve itself. He had been sitting with it since 0830. It was 1640, and he crossed the gate onto his yard. He found her at the assessment table, legal pad open, pen moving. She knew he was there from the moment he crossed the gate. Operational habit, awareness of exits, and who was near them. So deeply embedded, it required no conscious maintenance. She did not look up. He walked across the yard, took the assessment clipboard directly off the table without asking, without ceremony. Read her entries aloud in a contemptuous parody of assessment language, performing for the 11 cadre members and candidates in sight range. 2 entries. 3. He set the clipboard down without returning it. Then he wrapped his hand around her forearm above the wrist and began walking her toward the gate. I don't know who signed your mandate, but you're done on my yard. Let's go. His hand was on her arm, in front of 11 people, in front of Sergeant Major Reginald Okafor, who had been standing at the fence line since 1620, without moving, watching everything. Creek did not resist, did not pull, did not brace. Her body moved with him the way water moves, total compliance, No tension in the arm he was gripping. No opposing weight. No bracing of the shoulder. Breathing even. Moving because he was moving. And she had decided to let him move her. And the compliance was so complete that Hollister felt nothing in his grip that told him he was holding a person with any opinion about where she was going. She was simply moving. Patient. At the gate, he turned and released her arm. A dismissal, the gesture of someone returning a problem to the door before going back to the yard he owned. She took one step back, clean weight transfer off the released grip. Hip loaded, squared, both feet placed under her center. The movement built from repetition deep enough that it had no conscious component whatsoever. Not threatening, not demonstrating. Just what her body did when it had 3 feet of space and someone let go of her arm. Corporal Vance, 40 feet away across the yard, saw it. Okafor, at the fence, saw it. The movement itself was nothing. But the quality of it, the precision, the hip loading, the total absence of the off-balance stumble that belongs to someone grabbed and released, that was something. Without thinking, Hollister had returned the assessment binder to her when she didn't resist. It was in her left hand. She looked at him. She smiled. Small. Private. The expression of someone watching a sequence complete exactly as it was designed to complete. A fish arriving cleanly and entirely into a net it had spent 40 days constructing around its own behavior. Not triumphant. Not mean. Just accurate. The specific amusement of a person who has been waiting for something to happen and is watching it happen precisely as anticipated. Documented, she said. Just for him. Quiet, so none of the 11 witnesses heard the word. Hollister could not read the smile. He had run this yard for 4 years. He had worked with contractors, assessors, observers, administrators, junior officers who outranked him on paper, and learned quickly who owned the ground. He could not place what he was looking at. He turned and walked toward the instructor shed because remaining at the gate produced nothing useful. At the shed door, he stopped. He turned back once. She was still at the gate, still holding the binder, still wearing that expression, and in the quality of her stillness, in the binder held loosely in the left hand, in the way she occupied the space, he felt the shape of something shifting in the back of his understanding. He could not name it. He went inside. The question went with him. 11 people had watched Hollister cross the yard and take a contractor's arm and walk her to the gate. 11 people had seen the compliance, total, weightless, no struggle, and the release at the gate and the single step back, and the thing that came after the step back. Corporal Vance had seen the movement for the second time since day 3, and the second time was worse than the first because the first time could be explained as a trained reflex from a pipeline that washed her out. The second time was in the aftermath of someone grabbing her arm in front of 11 witnesses and walking her across the yard, and she had stood at the gate after, squared and settled, like someone who had just watched something conclude on schedule. Day 41. 0700 hours. The vehicle arrived at the installation gate at 0658 hours. The cadre received no notification. Colonel Marcus Webb, USMC 06, MARSOC J3 Operations, 44 years old, stepped through the Gate MP checkpoint in service uniform and walked across the installation grounds in the direction of the combatives' yard. He had driven 4 hours. He had not announced his arrival. He was here because an operational window was closing, and an operator had earned a specific acknowledgement that needed to happen on the ground she had worked. Sergeant Major Okafor was at the fence. He had been at the fence since 0650 hours, which was not unusual for a sergeant major who made regular ground circuits, and which was also not a coincidence. He stepped forward as Colonel Webb reached the perimeter. Operation Paladin, Okafor said, quiet and deliberate. The contractor is your asset. I want to name it correctly before you confirm. Webb looked at him. 2 full seconds. the kind of looking that evaluates a great deal in a short interval. "Go ahead, Sergeant Major." "The contractor is your asset." Webb did not answer. He walked through the gate onto the yard. Every eye on the active session tracked him. A colonel in service uniform crossing the yard directly and specifically toward the civilian contractor at the assessment table, not stopping at the pit, not acknowledging the cadre, not performing any of the social rituals that a senior officer performs when entering a subordinate's training environment. Just crossing. Directly. Every cadre member on the yard tracked that trajectory and could not make it fit. Hollister, at the pit, turned. Creek saw Webb at 30 feet. She set the clipboard down. She stood. She came to attention, not the startled, uncertain reflex of a civilian caught off guard by rank, but full attention, heels together. The position absolute and precise and practiced. Marine Corps regulation from 8 years of commissioned service. The specific formal stillness of someone for whom standing at attention has been second nature for so long, it requires no more thought than breathing. She rendered a salute, crisp, vertical. The angle exact, the stillness in it complete, arm locked at the proper angle, the whole motion executed with the authority of something so deeply embedded in muscle and bone that it lived entirely below conscious access. She held it. Webb returned it without hesitation, not casual, not abbreviated. The full deliberate formal return of a commanding officer acknowledging an operator who has completed a sanctioned mission in a denied environment for 41 days without a single break in cover, without a single deviation from the operational parameters, with a documentation package that would hold up through any review at any level. "Well done, Captain." The yard went completely still. Hollister, who had been watching from the pit. Captain. It moved through him in stages, each one arriving before he was finished processing the one before it. Confusion. A colonel in service uniform rendering a formal salute, returned to the civilian contractor. Disbelief. She had held it. Perfect position. Perfect hold. The posture of someone who had come to attention every day of a service career, and for whom the position was as automatic as drawing breath. Recognition. The manned-out document question on day 18, and why Mercer had looked uncertain when it was asked. The misconduct report that had failed to remove her. The indexed binder she carried every day on this yard. The smile at the gate, and the word she had said quietly so only he could hear, and what that word had meant. Horror. What all of it had meant. What 41 days of patience meant. What documented had meant. Gunnery Sergeant Hollister had spent 41 days running every institutional play available to him against a Marine Raider captain operating under direct authority from MARSOC Command. He had filed a formal misconduct report against her. He had put his hand on her arm in front of 11 witnesses and walked her toward the gate. She had let him. She had let him do every single thing he had done in front of every witness who was present, and she had documented every second of it, and the indexed binder was the documentation, and Colonel Marcus Webb standing on this yard was the consequence. At 07:22, 2 military police arrived on the yard. Hollister walked between them toward the gate. Not physically handled, walking, because the Marine in him understood the thing was over, and there was nothing in that understanding that changed anything. Every cadre NCO on the yard watched him cross the mat and pass through the gate. The yard was completely silent. Creek was already beside Colonel Webb, speaking quietly and efficiently, the voice of an operator delivering a mission debrief, clipped and organized and focused on what comes next. Her back was to Hollister. She did not watch him leave. The evidence package landed with the formal investigation authority at 1400 hours on day 41. 41 days of indexed documentation, 11 falsified candidate files cross-referenced with granular precision against original test results, each deviation dated and attributed. Physical documentation from the locker area encounter, time-stamped and complete. A session log covering every observed deviation from the standardized assessment protocol across 41 days, organized by date, cadre member, and candidate affected. 2 installation security footage clips that the cadre had not pulled because they had no reason to believe anyone was looking for them. 7 names. The architecture of the network mapped cleanly against the evidence in less than 3 hours. On day 42, 3 members of Hollister's enforcement chain had counterparts at a Marine Corps battalion training element 40 miles north of the installation. NCIS opened a parallel inquiry that afternoon. Captain Mercer was interviewed that same evening. She was not part of the ring. She had been processing Hollister's paperwork without reading it closely enough, which was a failure of oversight that she understood clearly without requiring it to be explained, and she cooperated immediately and completely. The administrative review that followed was something she had earned by missing what a more attentive officer would have caught, and she entered it without argument. On day 43, Staff Sergeant Decker received formal notification of the charges during a morning session he was running. He finished the session. It was the last thing he had authority to do, and he did it. Then he walked with the MPs. The exercise of that option was the last act of dignity available to him, and he chose it, and it was noted. The corrected assessment files were processed on day 45. Lance Corporal Priya Santosh read the notification in the barracks, alone, on a standard-issue device. A 2-line administrative email. Her actual assessment results, the scores from circuits she had completed correctly and been marked failing. The metrics from a pre-selection process that had been quietly engineered against her, reinstated. Pre-selection passed. She read it twice. She did not know who had been in that locker room 3 weeks ago with a clipboard and a memory that did not lose a single detail under pressure. She did not know who had taken one deliberate, unhurried step to place themselves between her and a staff sergeant, reading her failures aloud to an audience assembled to confirm them. She would find out eventually. That was a different story, and it would be told in its own time. 7 NCOs, 11 files corrected, 1 pipeline suspended, reviewed, reinstated with proper oversight in place. 41 days of saying nothing to people who were certain they had read her correctly. 41 days of writing everything down, of waiting for the moment to become documentable. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. 3 weeks later, day 62, 0600 hours. A bench near a training bay at a MARSOC facility. Exterior, the bay locked at this early hour. The parking area held 1 vehicle. The morning was gray and flat and patient, pre-dawn light that had not yet committed to the day. She sat with a coffee that had gone cold 11 minutes ago and a field journal open to a blank page. She turned to the inner cover of the journal. The folded photograph had been there through all 41 days on the installation, tucked into the cover before insertion, present in every bunk and every quarter she had occupied, never opened. She removed it from the inner pocket, held it for 3 seconds, felt the worn crease of the paper, the slight brittleness of something folded and refolded in the same lines over a long time. She folded it back along its original crease and returned it to the cover. She opened the journal to the blank page. She wrote 1 word. Fitch. That was all. That was the right amount. The secure device on the bench beside her buzzed. A contact request. The greeting was 6 words, structured in a phrasing she had been briefed on before the Sahel, a specific construction from a specific channel that she had been told she might receive and had not expected to receive for another 6 months, if she received it at all. She stared at the screen. Set the device face down on the bench. The training bay behind her was locked. The morning was gray and the coffee was cold, and she sat in it for a moment, in the quiet, just sitting. She picked up the device. She accepted the contact. Yusuf Mehdi had found her first. That was fine. She had expected him to. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.